Hello, and welcome to Week 4 of the Introduction 2020 Faculty Perspective Series. We've designed these programs to allow you to see the tremendous depth and breadth of academic and research interest amongst our faculty, and for you to preview many of the exciting things that you can study at the University of Oregon. Over the course of the summer, we are presenting faculty perspectives in 5 separate tracks that highlight the interdisciplinary nature of big questions. In our 5 programs today, we feature the School of Law, 2 departments within the College of Arts and Sciences, and the Lundquist College of Business. As a reminder to students who are watching, be sure you complete your reflection of this program after we're done by visiting community.uoregon.edu. Additionally, the last 15 minutes of this session will be dedicated to answering your questions live on camera. In Zoom, please use the Q&A feature on the bottom of your Zoom screen to ask your questions of our presenter. Today's faculty perspectives in the Environment and Climate Change track will ask if icebergs are a sign of climate change. I'm pleased to welcome Associate Professor of Earth Sciences, Dave Sutherland. Welcome, Professor Sutherland.
Thank you.
Take it away.
All right, thank you, Cora, and thanks everyone out there for watching. As an introduction, again, my name is Dave Sutherland. I'm an oceanographer actually in the Department of Earth Sciences here at the University of Oregon. I'm also core faculty in the Environmental Studies program. And the question that we're going to ask today that really gets at the heart of this idea of the environment and climate change is, are icebergs a sign of global climate change? That is, when you see an iceberg in the ocean, when you see icebergs calve off glaciers, is that a sign of impending doom? Is that a sign of global climate change? Or is that just a natural process? Or is neither of those true? And so we're going to try to answer that today. And just to put this in a broader perspective too, when we think about global climate change, I take a very scientific view of that, but remember that it's not just a science problem. Climate change needs to be tackled from every aspect that we study here at the University of Oregon. So, humanities, social science, College of Ed, law, as well as the College of Arts and Sciences, where I reside in the Earth Science Department. So the picture you're looking at here is a picture I took in southeast Greenland of Sermelik Fjord. And you're looking at the glacier on the right, and then on the left-hand side is a mixture of icebergs and sea ice. And underneath that mixture on the left is actually ocean water. So the fjord is there, you just can't see it because there's so much ice on top. And what we're going to watch in a second in a video is the birth of a new iceberg. And so as this video plays, you'll see an iceberg form on the right and quickly move out away from the glacier. So that glacier that is on the right there, you can stop the video now, is called Helheim Glacier. And it's hard to get a sense of scale here, but that glacier is about 3 miles wide and about half a mile deep. And so that iceberg that just calved off that is tremendous in size, right? If you were to try to fit that in Autzen Stadium, there's no way it would fit inside any football stadium. Right? So this thing is about half a mile wide and again about half a mile deep as it calves off and births. We say calving an iceberg because the old whalers and people that described calving originally thought it kind of looked like a whale giving birth to a new calf. So we're going to talk about icebergs and whether they're natural or not. But first I want to give you a sense of, again, who I am and really where I came from and why I find icebergs so fascinating. So as I mentioned, I'm a professor in the Department of Earth Sciences, and I also am core faculty in our Environmental Studies program, which means in the Environmental Studies program I get to interact with a whole host of faculty from across the university, historians, geomorphologists, economists, as well as English professors, and we all try to tackle these really wicked problems that are sort of facing our globe today. So here I've just pictured a very atypical iceberg, one that's covered in dirt and sediment, just so you get a sense that all icebergs aren't white and blue. You can also have icebergs that are what we call a dirty berg. And then really important to me too is a sense of community here. So my lab group, which is undergraduates, graduate students, postdocs, we all meet every week, and it's really a fun way to participate in the university sort of culture, is to get involved in a lab and a research group, and I'll talk more about that at the end today. And then finally, I really love to do field work, and that's what got me into oceanography. And so that picture in the bottom right, what you see is a group of us out on a ship. We typically go out a few times a year. We go out to sea and we collect data, and that data is what we end up then analyzing and looking at for the rest of the year when we're back here in Eugene. And so I kind of get my fix of going out in the field and going to places such as Greenland as well as Southeast Alaska. We've sent people to Antarctica and to Chile any place where there's ice meeting the ocean. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. So today, just to give you a sense of where we're going, I typically, when I teach classes, I typically do a think, pair, share activity, and that's a little bit harder today when you're watching via live, or maybe you're going to watch this recorded. And then we're going to do a science experiment, and I'll show you that in a second. And I'll talk a little bit more about why I choose to study cold, watery places like the ocean, especially here in a place that's landlocked, even though we're pretty close to the ocean. A little bit about how I conduct my research, and then how you can get involved, right? There's a million different ways to get involved in research here at UO, not just environment and climate change, but in other avenues as well. And then I'll sort of pass it back to you and think about, well, where can you go from here? What are the opportunities at UO, and what is my advice for getting involved? So let's get back to the question I just asked. So are icebergs a sign of global climate change? Typically, when we think of icebergs, we immediately think of climate change these days, and especially this generation of high school students and college students. They've been inundated with pictures of ice and crashing icebergs and polar bears floating on sea ice. And the question really is, well, are icebergs a natural phenomenon, or are they really a sign of sort of an increasing greenhouse gas emissions, warming oceans, warming atmospheres, and sort of this climate change effect? And so to get at that a little bit, I'm going to show you a video in a second about that shows a glacier flowing. So here it is. This is the Kant Glacier in southeast Alaska. So it's flowing down from the Stikine ice field, and it flows from right to left here. And this is a time-lapse photo sort of montage that is sped up. So this is about, it goes from March to August of 2016. So it's about 5 months. And what you can see here is the glacier. The ice is flowing very rapidly down. It flows about 20 meters per day. So if you're out there looking, you could watch this glacier actually flow about 3 feet every hour. So it's actually visible to see this glacier flow. And then on the left-hand side, you see where the glacier actually empties into the ocean. And that's where icebergs form. And so this glacier in particular, and a lot of glaciers do this, every winter it advances a little bit, and every summer it retreats a little bit. And it does this back and forth seasonally, just like we have seasonal weather patterns. Glaciers have weather, and the ocean has weather. A lot of different natural phenomena have these seasonal patterns. And one way that a glacier loses ice, right? So it's transporting ice from the ice field down to the ocean. Okay, and that's a natural process. And one way it loses ice at the interface where it touches the ocean is through icebergs, right? So you can see that the glacier is really crevassed, right? There's all these holes and gaps and ravines. And as those crevasses approach the ocean, that's a natural break where these icebergs form. And so it's just a natural process. You could have a glacier that's not retreating, that's not diminishing or dying, as we hear about a lot these days, and it would still be calving icebergs because you're still getting an ice flux at the top of the glacier. Okay, so this picture should drive home, or this movie should drive home the fact that iceberg calving is a really natural process, and it doesn't necessarily mean that the glacier is unhealthy or dying. It's just a way for the glacier to lose the ice that it's gaining up above. The other way that a glacier loses mass is melting. Right, so it can either break off a solid chunk of ice, like an iceberg, like an ice cube just falling off the glacier, or it can melt. It can actually just form, the ice just melts into liquid water, and that runs off into the ocean. And so in my lab, we study both of those processes, and we actually study the interaction between those processes, because that's really the important part here is, as an oceanographer, for a long time, we just studied the ocean. And then there's people that study the ice. We call those people glaciologists, and they study the ice. And it's really those boundaries that are the new frontiers of research. So studying the actual ice-ocean interface is really a surging sort of topic of interest these days, right? Because there's these feedbacks between what happens in the ocean and what happens in the ice, and you can't study one without the other. And that's really true of a lot of these environmental fields these days. You tug on one aspect of the environmental or the global climate system, and you start feeling all the other effects and all the other processes. In this system, you also can't take away the atmosphere. You can't take away the sediment, the bedrock there, the geology. All these things are important to understand. Okay. So to give you a little bit more of a sense and to give you a real life sense of what ice-ocean interactions is all about in the field that I study. We're going to do a really simple experiment here. And so I've got 2 jars here. We're going to start the experiment over here. So 2 jars. We're going to put some water in these jars. I'll try not to make a mess. So we're going to fill it up about halfway. This is just fresh water, tap water. I got another bottle here. So the point of this experiment, I'll show you in a second. Oh, made a mess. They're going to be mad. Are those about even? Okay. So the difference between fresh water and the oceans is salt, right? Everyone knows this. You go in the ocean, you taste a little salt in your mouth. The question is really, how does salt and how does the ocean affect melting ice, right? We're putting freshwater ice into the ocean. How does that impact ice melting in the ocean, right? You also have freshwater ice in lakes and rivers. Okay, but we're studying the ocean here. Okay, so if we go back to our experiment here, we're going to make a little ocean water. We brought salt, okay? The sodium chloride, we're going to make this one salt water. Instant ocean here. Stir it up. Turns out the ocean has, a few more minerals and types of salt in it, but we'll just use sodium chloride for now. Okay, so now we've got, you have to remember which one is which. We've got our salt water here, fresh water here. Okay, and we're going to put ice in these now. I brought some ice. We're just going to fill these up. Need more ice, lots of ice. This is our icebergs. Uh-oh. Let's see, I want to make them as even as possible. Okay, that looks pretty good. Okay, so what this is supposed to look like now is, well, like the picture you're seeing there on the screen, like a fjord with icebergs and sea ice on it. Okay, and so if we go back here to the experiment, we're going to make 2 observations. Okay, first of all, one prediction that you need to make, so think about in your mind, is what's going to happen to the water level. Okay, we just added ice in here. As this ice melts, is the water level going to go up? Is it going to go down? Or is it going to stay the same? So that's one question you should ask yourself. The other question is, in which jar is the ice going to melt faster? Or maybe they're going to melt the same. So fresh water is going to melt faster, or salt water is going to melt faster, or they're going to melt the same. So those are 2 things we're going to look at in a little bit, and we'll try to come up with some explanations for why that is, and then some implications of that for why the ocean is so different than a freshwater lake. I'm kind of giving away a little bit. There is going to be a difference. So we'll come back to this experiment in a little bit. Okay, so as we wait for our experiment to sort of evolve and get back to it, I just thought I'd tell you a little bit about how I got started as an oceanographer, because it's not something that you hear about a lot in high school or growing up, unless you grew up on the coast or you grew up near a research lab that does oceanography. I certainly didn't know about it until I went to college and took an oceanography class. And so if you play this video that shows the surface circulation of the ocean, it was videos like this that I took an oceanography class in college, like an Oceanography 101. And we offer that class here at UO. That really blew me away, because all of a sudden you see the really rich nature of ocean currents and circulation at this really large global scale, right? We live on a water planet. It shouldn't be called Earth, right? Our planet should be called ocean. And so I think I just got enraptured by this. And the other really fun thing about oceanography is that we don't know anything about the ocean. It's so vast and so hard to get to and so hard to access that you can really make some big discoveries still in the ocean. Whereas a lot of other sciences, it's been so well trodden and there's people working in labs and you have to really get detailed. Whereas in the ocean, you go out on ships and you can actually describe new things that people have never seen before. And so that really appealed to me. But this video is taken from a NASA website. It's a public domain video that uses satellites to look at how the surface currents evolve around the ocean. And what you should see is that there's these large-scale patterns, but then there's also like ocean weather. Okay, you'll see lots of little cyclones and storms in the ocean. That should kind of remind you of a weather map that you see when you look at your local weather. And in particular, this is now off the coast of Japan, which is a lot like off the coast of our East Coast. There's a big current there, a big river. That's called the Kurashio that you're looking at right now. And if we go back to the slide now, And now we're looking at a picture of the North Atlantic Ocean on the bottom there, and then a zoom in on what we call the subarctic or the subpolar gyre. And so if you've heard of the Gulf Stream before, that's the big current that runs off the east coast of the United States. And that current brings warm water northward towards the Arctic Ocean, towards Greenland. You can see Greenland there in the middle of that picture. And that North Atlantic current, it's red there, and it's red for a reason, because it's bringing heat from the tropics and bringing it up to the Arctic. And that's really what the ocean does, and it's really what our atmosphere does. You know, the sun warms up the tropics more, and all the ocean and atmosphere, their whole job is to transport that energy from the tropics and distribute it towards the poles. Otherwise, our Earth would be warming up around the tropical regions and it'd be cooling down over the poles. Okay, so all the weather that we have, the jet stream, the Gulf Stream in the ocean, all that stuff is really just a way for our climate system to redistribute heat. Okay, and so the particular place that I study is affected by this really large-scale ocean circulation. So if you can see Greenland there, it's bathed in this warm water from the North Atlantic. Okay, so there's this, we call it warm water, but by the time it reaches Greenland, it's cooled down to about 4 degrees Celsius, so it's not super warm. You wouldn't want to go swimming in it. And then some of that water even goes all the way up into the Arctic Ocean and circulates around. And so this large-scale circulation, you know, sets up the ocean currents that melt the glaciers in Greenland. They also affect what happens in the Arctic Ocean. They also transport icebergs that come off Greenland far away, right? If you've probably heard of the Titanic disaster. That happened off Newfoundland, off the coast of Canada. And that was an iceberg transported from the Greenland ice sheet all the way down the coast of Labrador, all the way to off the coast of Newfoundland and Canada into the shipping lanes. And so why I study the ocean, why I study these cold places in particular, is because climate change is affecting them more so than other places in the world. So there's this effect called Arctic amplification. All that means is the Arctic is warming faster than anywhere else in the world. And parts of the Southern Ocean and Antarctica are as well. And so we have to be, you know, I think as an oceanographer and as someone who's interested in climate science, you want to go to where the high impact science is, and that's what we're doing. So just a little intro to how ice sheets work. Okay, so I just showed you the oceanography of the region around Greenland. Here's a really simple conceptual idea of how an ice sheet works. So you're looking at a diagram here that kind of shows the Greenland ice sheet. You've got rock underneath, and on top of the rock you have the ice. Okay, so in the middle of the picture is the middle of the ice sheet, and it's actually this big dome that rises to about 2 miles of ice thickness in the middle of the ice sheet. And so you're gaining ice there because it just snows. It snows a lot more than it melts. And so you can gain ice in the middle of the ice sheet, gain snow, and that snow eventually turns into ice, and it actually starts flowing. So the definition of a glacier and ice sheet is actually ice that flows. Okay, so those little lines that you see there actually depict how the ice is flowing from the middle of the ice sheet towards the edges. And those edges of the ice sheet are the places where it then reaches the ocean, and that's where the melt happens. Okay, so the way that the Greenland ice sheet loses mass, or in this case what I mean by mass is just the way it loses ice, is it can either melt and run off in what we call the ablation zone. All ablation means is that a melt zone. Or it can melt underneath the water. That's called subglacial melting. That's number 2. And the third one is iceberg calving. So the glaciers that I just showed you earlier, a movie of an iceberg calving from a glacier. That's solid ice getting broken off from the glacier and then floating off into the ocean. And so the really interesting thing about icebergs is that they don't melt right at the edge of the ice sheet. All the other fresh water that Greenland and Antarctica are putting in melts right at the edge. Icebergs actually take that fresh water and they can move it out into the ocean really far away. And that's a process that we don't understand completely in terms of how fast those icebergs melt and where the icebergs go. It's really hard to predict the path of a single iceberg. We can kind of make guesses and use statistics to get a sort of a mean path, but it's hard to predict one single iceberg path. Okay, so we're going to study icebergs a little more here, and in particular what I do a lot is go into the field and study icebergs. And so what I'm going to show you in a second here is a video taken by drone of our actual field work in southeast Greenland. So the video, as it plays now, is going to show you what you're looking at is the surface of an iceberg, and the sensors that you see on there are actually GPS units so that we can track the movement of this iceberg. And you'll see the beautiful white. This is not a dirty berg. This is a very beautiful white berg that has blue, rich blues in it. And then you see the ocean around it. And you see that how many thousands, tens of thousands of icebergs exist in this fjord. Okay, so as a whole, they're putting fresh water into the surface layers of the fjord. Okay, but they're also moving down fjord and putting fresh water in places where there's not glaciers or there's not ice sheets. And so to do that work, we often use, you just saw that ship at the end of the video. We'll go to these fieldwork areas and we have to use ships of opportunity because research vessels won't typically go into the fjords because there's too much ice. Okay, so the places that we work are typically not very crowded places, but can be really nice. You saw that it was nice and sunny and blue skies. So we go there in the summer and we get one shot kind of to get this data. But what we get from that is really cool. So this is some data that we just got last summer of 2019. So what you're looking at here is a reconstruction of an iceberg surface from drone photos. So it turns out there's a technique you can take to take photos around an iceberg and reconstruct the subaerial or the above water portion. And if we do this repeatedly, we can actually get a difference map of how this iceberg is changing over time. Okay, but we add to this what's really cool about the data we have. So this is what happens above the surface. You can actually imagine getting this from satellites, right? Google Maps, let's just zoom in and we can get this picture almost. But what we also did was take underwater data and we actually got this subsurface imagery of what the iceberg looks like underneath. And as you all know, right, tip of the iceberg, most of the iceberg is underneath the water. And so it's really important to get what the shape of the iceberg looks like underneath the water. And so this iceberg is 400 meters wide, that's 1,200 feet or so, 200 meters deep. So again, it extends about 600, 700 feet down. And it just has this beautiful shape to it. And that's really important because as you go down in the ocean, the temperature of the water changes. So we need to know exactly how far these things reach if we want to be able to predict where they melt, how fast they melt, the impact of that melt on ecosystems around Greenland, around other places where icebergs form. So we did this not just for one iceberg, but for a whole host of icebergs. So this is just a picture of, 6 icebergs from last summer, showing you a diversity of shapes. So a very large iceberg there in the upper right, 730 meters long, so almost a kilometer long iceberg, down to an iceberg that we would call small, which is 80 meters long. Of course, there's much, much smaller ones, right? A car-sized berg is just something you just kind of ignore in the fjord. It's just a bergy bit. But because most of the volume of ice that we're thinking about is in these really, really large icebergs. Okay, so we get that data, and what we can do with that data is then give that to people who make these really large global Earth system models. These are the people trying to predict sea level rise. They're trying to predict what's going to happen to the Gulf Stream in the future. Because it turns out that icebergs are an important factor. Where they melt can impact global ocean circulation. How icebergs form and where icebergs form, how much ice is discharged in the ocean, that's going to affect global sea level rise. And I'll talk more about that in a second. Okay, so hopefully I've convinced you that icebergs are actually a natural phenomenon. So they're not necessarily a sign of global climate change. Of course, there is this concern that Greenland and Antarctica are losing more ice every year than they're gaining, right? And so we call it, I showed you the conceptual picture of Greenland a few slides ago, where snow is accumulating in the middle and it's losing mass on the edges. If you lose more mass, more ice on the edges than you're gaining in the middle, then the ice sheet is going to start shrinking over time, right? You can think of it like your bank account. You're drawing out more money than you're putting in. You're going to go in the negative pretty soon. And so in general, Greenland and Antarctica are losing hundreds of gigatons per year of ice more than they're gaining now. And that's a concern. That's what's raising sea level. That's what's potentially going to change global ocean circulation. And so we want to be able to, and when we kind of know global climate change is happening and the ultimate effect is going to be to melt the Greenland ice sheet and the Antarctic ice sheet, the real question is how fast and then what the effects are locally and regionally. Like, are the effects on the west coast going to be the same as on the east coast? And beyond sea level rise impacts, we want to think about how icebergs move that fresh water into the North Atlantic. And of course, as people drill for oil in the North Sea, they drill for oil off the coast of Canada. icebergs are actually a hazard to these shipping companies and oil companies. And so they're really concerned about icebergs. And then icebergs have been explored as a freshwater source. Even recently in South Africa, Cape Town had serious proposals to bring icebergs as a freshwater resource to their shore. There's a lot of problems with that, but that's another story. Okay, let's go back to our experiment and see if we came up with anything. So if you remember, this one is our saltwater. This one is our freshwater. First off, we can see right away that the ice is melted and the level of the water didn't change, right? So this answers our first question. Icebergs, their impact on sea level rise only occurs right when they calve off a glacier. That's when they have their sea level rise impact. As they melt, as they move around the oceans and melt, they're not going to affect sea level rise anymore, right? Every time you get a cup of water and put ice in it, it's not like your cup of water starts overflowing because the ice melts. Okay. The other thing you can see, maybe, is that our freshwater ice melted a little faster than our saltwater ice over here. Can everyone see that? I think it's obvious. Okay, and I'll show you why in a second. We have some food coloring here, some green food coloring. I'm going to put a few drops in each container here. This is the saltwater. This is the freshwater. Well, let's do the saltwater first, okay? You can kind of see it there. Not much really happening. Let's put some in the freshwater and see what happens. Okay. Big difference, right? So the thing we notice here is that in the freshwater case, the dye is sort of, the dye which we hope is kind of just tracking the water. I maybe put a little too much dye in the saltwater here because some of the dye is sinking here too. But the dye here is sinking to the bottom. So why is that? Well, remember that in our saltwater case, we put freshwater ice on top, and freshwater is less dense than saltwater, right? So salt gives a little bit more density because you're adding stuff to the water. And so when you melt freshwater on top, it sits, so there's this freshwater layer up here sitting now where the ice had melted. And so as that ice melts, it's cold, right? But that cold water, since it's sitting just up here in the upper layer, it's actually insulating the ice from melting more. Whereas in the freshwater case, right, we have fresh water and we have freshwater ice. As that ice melts, it's cold. There's no salt in this case, so colder water is more dense than warmer water. And so in that case, the cold water sinks, and you set up what we call a convection cell, where water sinks in the middle and kind of rises back up. And what that does is actually take that, it brings the heat of the water that was down here back up to the ice and melts the ice faster. Okay, and so the point of this is to tell you one thing about the ocean. First of all, it's salty, and there's changes in density that are really important to understand. It turns out usually the ocean isn't just one density, right? It's layered, it's got different levels of density throughout it. And so where you melt the ice really impacts where that meltwater ends up. And in fact, even if we play around with this, like we try to push the dye down, it'll actually rebound back up and sit within that freshwater layer. And we can actually set up these little, what we call internal waves. You know, you're all familiar with waves at the ocean surface. Those are actually internal waves between air and water. If you have, because air is less dense than water, if we have fresh water and salt water, you can actually set up waves along that interface because there's a density contrast between those. All right, so now you learn a little bit about the ocean, maybe. Okay, so let's keep going. I'm running out of time here, but so maybe you've learned a little bit about are icebergs a sign of global climate change, and a little bit about the ocean, because the ocean is a really important part of the global climate system. We can't really ignore it and just study the Earth or the atmosphere. And to get into this at UO, right, and this is broader than just my lab or my research, but many labs have opportunities for undergrads where you work directly with professors, you work directly with postdocs or graduate students, and sometimes you work with other undergrads, and you may get the opportunity to go in the field or do a laboratory experiment, and you may even get the opportunity to present at a research symposium. So we have this really great undergrad research symposium, which is a really friendly, informal, nurturing environment where people get the experience to present the research that they work really hard on. My other advice is to take courses that sound interesting, right? And that might sound trite and trivial, but it's true. Like college is your chance to take something that is outside the box, right? You know, even if you want to get a job in economics or you know, you have this path, like I'm going to be a business major, why not take a class while you're here and explore a new major? And don't stereotype majors. I was a math major in college, and I was still able to take all these science classes. And I think with earth sciences, people think of it as rocks, and it's much, much more than that, right? As I said, Earth is not just rocks. It's the ocean. It's the atmosphere. It's everything underneath the ocean. It's the inside of the Earth. I mean, it's a really dynamic major that gets you out in the field, or you do satellite remote sensing, or you do laboratory experiments. So I think you got to try it before you dismiss a major. And then finally, if you are interested in marine science and ocean science, feel free to contact me or check out my website for more. I just talked about one aspect of my research here. We also do a lot of things at the Oregon coast, down at the Oregon Marine Lab in Charleston, Oregon, in Coos Bay, where the UO has a marine lab facility. So I think I'll end with this question here about where you can go from here, and think about, while at UO, how could you pursue research or get engaged? And I think, think about this as you leave today, and really it just takes a little bit of confidence and a little bit of boldness in reaching out to a faculty member. We don't bite, and we don't, we're not too scary. So just email me or email somebody and ask, like, how do I get involved in research? The worst they can say is no. Or maybe they don't answer your email, but I'll answer, I promise. And so I think just get involved the best you can. I know it's going to be a weird year in terms of getting involved in person, but there are a lot of things you can do online, especially with the data that we've collected and the numerical simulations that we run now. There's a lot of stuff we do with computers that is really amenable to online research. So thanks a lot for your time, and I'm happy to take questions from here.
Thank you so much. We do have several questions from students who not only want to know more about how to connect with you and others in your area, but some who have questions about the content area. So I want to ask, I want to make sure we get to those questions as well. Stephen wants to know, do you think it's too late to reverse some of the circular melting processes of climate change, for example, snow cover reduction?
Yeah, that's a good question, Stephen. We're certainly locked into a certain level of climate change right now. Even if we were to shut down greenhouse gas emissions tomorrow, there's a lag time, or there's a built-in inertia in the global climate system that means it takes hundreds of years to get some of the CO2 and methane and other greenhouse gases out of the atmosphere. That doesn't mean we shouldn't reduce our emissions. We can't sit on our haunches and not do anything. But we do have to live and adapt with the climate system that we have and the effects that we've already built into it. So yeah, some of it's irreversible, but there's more effects that are still reversible.
Thank you. So we also want to know, how does your study of oceanography intersect with other areas of study at the UO? What perspectives do the other disciplines bring to the study of the ocean?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I can answer that in two ways. One is I intersect a lot with other sciences at UO. So I work with biologists often who study critters and organisms that live in these ocean places. And it turns out that the physical oceanography, the ocean physics, which is what I study, like how the currents move and how the density of the ocean changes, really dictates where you find ocean life. And in some cases, it actually moves, like, if you want to study oyster larvae or Dungeness crab larvae, those currents are actually moving those larvae around. And so it's a really coupled question in how you answer those two things. So I work a lot with marine biologists down in Charleston and Coos Bay, as well as here on main campus. Outside of science, though, as I mentioned at the outset, right, climate change and environmental science inherently has this human component, right? And so you have to work with social scientists and historians. And I have a really rich collaboration with a historian in the environmental studies program in Clark Honors College, Mark Carey, where we look at the human impacts of ice loss and what that means. You go ask someone in Greenland, right? So there are people that live in Greenland, like 60,000 people. You ask them what is the biggest issue they're facing, and 9 times out of 10 they won't mention ice. They'll mention something else, right? And so I think sometimes we bring this really Western-centric view of, oh, Greenland is this ice sheet and nothing else is there. That's all that matters. But it's a lot more than that. And I think we have to remind ourselves of that First of all, there's human aspects to this climate problem, and second of all, it's not just a U.S. Western-centric view. It's bigger than that. So we talk a lot about those sorts of issues in the environmental studies program.
Thank you for that. So one of the other questions that we had from Lauren is, what classes can incoming freshmen take to continue learning about this topic?
Yeah, so there's a few really good classes at UO. There's a Oceanography 101. It's actually, the number is Earth 307, but you can take it as a freshman. That's basically, it'll cover not just physical oceanography, which I talked about today, but also the chemistry of the ocean, plate tectonics, biological oceanography. So that's a really good one. There's also a course called the Water Planet, which is offered in biology department, which touches on oceanography. And then, beyond that, I think there's a lot of great classes that you can take down to the coast in marine biology, if that's more of your interest. But I'd say if you want to do ocean physics or ocean chemistry or ocean biology, often we actually suggest students just follow the typical path that a biologist would, or a physicist would, or a chemist, and then you sort of specialize later. So it's really, I guess my advice is lay the fundamentals first, so take a lot of math and science normally, and then add in a little bit of the specialty later on.
Thank you. Actually, I'm going to pitch in one of my own questions about that. You mentioned the fundamentals of science. Can you talk about why that is important to start there, and how how the University of Oregon does that? I think that's one of those things students often want to go directly into an applied science, and what the importance of learning those foundational bits are to a person's overall study and specialization down the road.
Right. Yeah, that's a good question. I can take my personal experience as one. I was a math major in college and then got into oceanography in graduate school, mostly because there's very few colleges that offer oceanography as a major, and that's for a reason. It's because they want you to get a good background in math. The more math and physics you can take to do what I do, the better. And the same thing for biology or chemistry. You need to know those sort of fundamental principles before you apply it to the ocean. I mean, it's just, you could think of an atmospheric science, someone who studies weather, as they will do the same thing. They'll take math and physics before they go on to take meteorology and atmospheric science. And so there's a lot of core things that we share that we can teach and that we really excel at here at UO before you can actually divert off to these specialties like in oceanography or glaciology or geomorphology, all these specialties that you hear about that are really exciting. At their core, they are just earth science, or they're just chemistry, or they're just biology applied in a very special way.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Bryn wants to know, can you speak about the value of pursuing an environmental studies major versus an environmental science major?
Yeah, so there's a little distinction there. So the environmental studies program has those two undergrad majors. One is environmental studies, and if you follow that path, you'll take a lot more social science classes, humanities classes, so like English, history. You might go down a road that's more investigating climate justice issues or environmental justice issues. Whereas if you're an environmental science major, you actually get to pick two tracks, either physical science, so that would be more like what I showed today, like maybe oceanography or earth science, or you can take a life science track where you study like the water quality or biology of a system. And so one is definitely much more sciencey than the other. So I think you have to but they're still very interdisciplinary, and I think that's the beauty of the environmental studies program, is that either track, either major that you pick, you'll still take classes from the other one. So even if you're an environmental science major, you'll still take humanities classes and social science classes because they want to give you that breadth of study.
Thank you. Kit wants to know, what can we do to prevent further damage caused by climate change? What action should we change, and what decisions should we make?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think it's at all levels, right? There's individual actions everyone can take day to day, and if you add those up over millions of people, it makes a difference. Of course, the biggest players here are large corporations that are polluting greenhouse gases. There's federal policy that can be altered to encourage green energy or other resource or incentives. So I think we have to sort of start firing at all these levels, right? We need individuals to take action. We need individuals to put pressure on corporations and on governments to take action. And we just need to sort of raise awareness. And I know that this current generation has the awareness. You see it in the high school level and the college level, right? They know, they've been told about climate change since they were born. whereas that wasn't the case for our generation. So I think some of this is also generational. As we go through this, over the next 5-10 years, the people even teaching college classes will be coming from a generation that has known climate change since the beginning. And I think things will start to change then. So yeah, that's the sort of the cynical view, is it's just going to have to wait, because I think we've been trying, but not much is happening, and there's got to be this sort of wake-up call at some point.
Thank you. Christine wants to know, how would an undergraduate get involved in the research symposium? What do they need to do?
Oh, that's a good question. Yeah, so to get involved in the research symposium, usually you're involved in a lab or a group, doing your own research. And then your mentor, whether that's a faculty member or a graduate student, will help you sort of submit what's called an abstract. All it means is you submit a little summary of your research to the symposium, and then they accept that, and you get slotted into a slot. Like, okay, you're going to give a poster presentation this day about your research to a group of people, or you're going to give a little short talk, like a 12-minute talk about your research on this day. And it's really, as I mentioned, it's a really informal and really great way to ease into presenting your research. And I guess I'll make a plug for it, because we can do science in a vacuum, right? We can just stay in our buildings over here and on campus, and if we never communicate it, then it actually doesn't matter at all. And so hand in hand with science is science communication, and I think we have to do both really well. And so as a student, I was mentioning get involved in research, but you also need to get involved in ways to practice your communication as well as your writing. You have to be a good writer, and you have to be a good communicator to do science well.
Thank you. I'm going to pitch another one of my own questions in about, you've talked a little bit about the Undergraduate Research Symposium. It sounds to me like you've had some experience either watching your own students participate in that, or you've seen some benefit on your own, like you've seen some great ideas, or listened to something that a student has produced that has been intriguing to you. Can you give us an example of either a student that you know who's participated in the symposium, or something that you've drawn from it?
Yeah, sure. I think so. Students in my own group, I've had probably half a dozen undergrads. Usually I have 1 or 2 per year, and it's up to them if they want to present, but often I'll encourage them. And then when they go present, it gives them this sort of like endpoint, and they have to come up with a product. They have to come up with something to deliver, right? Because the other challenge of research is that it's sort of just never ending, right? There's always more science to do. There's always more questions. So it's nice to have these sort of presentation points where you have to come up with some slides, right? Some graphics, some way to convey all that you've been doing over the last year to your audience, and say, why is it important? What is it that we've been doing that's new, and why does that matter? And what does it mean going forward, right? Science is very incremental, right? We build off what's been done before. And I think students really realize that when they go present, because they have to actually put everything together. And it's on them to get up there and explain why it's important. They can't just say, oh, I'm in Dave Sutherland's lab and we do this cool stuff. They actually have to get up there and say it themselves. And so it brings them a little more ownership to their research that I think is really important, right? Because after that, then all of a sudden they're like, oh yeah, I can do this. And then they use that as a bridge to go on to other careers, be it graduate school or government or environmental consulting gig or whatever it is. It's a really good experience.
Thank you. Okay, Erica wants to know, and this will be our last question. Erica wants to know, how does climate change affect marine life, and do animals depend on the presence of icebergs?
Yeah, so those are 2 good questions. The first one is very broad. Mm-hmm. Climate change affects sea life in a myriad of different ways, right? It's warming the upper ocean, and so if you're an organism that depends on a certain temperature range, and that temperature range is changing, then you have to adapt. So habitat ranges of different organisms are changing, right? Maybe they're shifting northwards or they're shifting south, whatever it's happening, these organisms have to adapt. The other big problem is ocean acidification, right? So the oceans are also the pH of the oceans is lowering. And that has a really big effect on organisms that make shells because they can't make their shells as well. And that has all these ripple effects. So those are 2 kind of broad scale effects of climate change. And then the second question that you asked about icebergs affecting ecosystems is actually really interesting because there is a really neat effect. And I'll talk about Antarctica for a second, but Antarctic ice sheet produces these really large icebergs. And as those icebergs move around Antarctica, they melt. And that fresh water that melts off the ice actually has a tiny amount of micronutrients in it. It actually has iron in it. And that iron actually triggers these phytoplankton blooms. So phytoplankton are the little plants of the ocean. And so you can watch these icebergs move around, and behind them are these just blooms of plant life, and those are the base of the food web. And so once you have that bloom, then you have other stuff that eats that, and other stuff that eats that. And so they can actually be these triggers in the ocean. And so icebergs can sort of mix up the ocean and affect marine life directly, which is pretty cool.
Thank you. I think that's a great way to end. And for you students who've asked questions that we might not have time to get to today, we will connect you with Professor Sutherland and make sure that you have a chance to ask your questions of him as well. So I want to make sure that we just say thank you for your time today. For those of you who are watching, again, be sure for you students to log on to community.uoregon.edu to submit your reflections on this faculty perspectives, because we want you to stay on track to complete introduction. Other ways that you can continue to stay on track to be ready for fall term include uploading your selfie for your UOID card. We'll be mailing those here in August fairly soon, so get those in. Check your @uoregon.edu email every single day to make sure that you're on track. Keep an eye out for information about room selection and housing. That's coming up fairly quickly. Complete your financial aid checklist, and be sure you've set reminders for yourself to have your final transcript sent to the UO and submit your immunization records to the health center. For links to find out more about these and complete these steps, I encourage you to visit our website at orientation.uoregon.edu. You can click on the Next Step section to find out more. And also, for questions about this or any other introduction program, you can email us at orientation@uoregon.edu or text us your questions at 541-346-1159. If you'd like to learn more about academic advising at the University of Oregon, I'd encourage you to listen to tomorrow's episode of Flock Talk from your favorite podcast platform or from flocktalk.uoregon.edu. Thank you again for your time today, and to you, Professor Sutherland, thank you so much for helping our new ducks get ready for fall.
Yeah, thank you so much for the opportunity. Look forward to seeing you in the fall.